The North Atlantic, May 4, 1943. 40 German U-boats are closing in on a single convoy. 40 submarines against 16 escort ships. The math is brutal. The outcome should be obvious. It wasn't. What happened over the next 72 hours would end Germany's 3-year stranglehold on the Atlantic. Not with a bang, not with some heroic last stand, but with something the Germans couldn't see, couldn't hear, and didn't believe was possible. This is the story of how a piece of copper the size of a coffee mug won the Battle of the Atlantic. Convoy Ons 5 left Liverpool on April 21st with 43 merchant ships. Grain from Canada, steel from America, oil, medicine, everything Britain needed to stay alive. The escorts knew they were outgunned before they even reached open water. Intelligence reports were coming in hourly. Wharf packs assembling. U-boats converging from every direction. By April 28th, submarine U-650 had spotted them 400 miles south of Greenland. In Paris, Admiral Donitz looked at the plot and saw an opportunity he'd been waiting for. He issued orders across the Atlantic. Every available boat, every commander. 2 wolf packs star and think 43 submarines total. The largest concentration of U-boats ever deployed against a single convoy. It should have been a slaughter for 3 years. German submarines had owned the Atlantic. They hunted at night, invisible on the surface, faster than most escorts, positioning themselves miles ahead of convoys and striking from total darkness. March 1943 had been their best month yet. 82 Allied ships sent to the bottom. 476,000 tons. Britain was bleeding out. Fuel reserves down to 3 months. Food stockpiles at emergency levels. Churchill's advisors were quietly discussing terms of surrender if the losses continued. The numbers told a simple story. Germany had 240 operational U-boats by May. 118 were at sea. Shipyards were launching 20 new boats every month. Allied forces were sinking fewer than 10. The math was working. Britain would run out of ships, out of fuel, out of time. But something had shifted. Something the Germans couldn't explain. April losses had been higher than usual. 15 boats. Not catastrophic, but unusual. Experienced commanders started filing reports that didn't make sense. British destroyers appearing without warning. Aircraft finding surface submarines in pitch darkness with impossible accuracy. Depth charges detonating with precision even when boats executed perfect evasion maneuvers. Werner Henker was one of the best. U-515. 23 ships sunk. Over 140,000 tons. In late April, he'd attacked convoy TS-37 of West Africa and gutted it. 7 ships in 12 hours using new magnetic detonators. It was textbook. Brilliant, even. He'd been awarded the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, but during that attack, something happened that Henker couldn't shake. A British destroyer had materialized out of nowhere. His METOX radar detected the device that was supposed to warn him of enemy radar at 9 miles, had stayed completely silent. The destroyer got close enough to open fire before Henker even knew it was there. He crash-dived and barely escaped. He wrote it up in his patrol log. Equipment malfunction, maybe. Or operator error under stress. When he got back to base at L'Oréal, engineers checked the METOX receiver. It tested perfectly. No problems. Working exactly as designed. They told him it must have been combat confusion. He'd missed the signal. It happens. Except it kept happening. Coveting Captain Eric Top had heard similar stories from other commanders. Aircraft finding them at night. Escorts appearing without any radar warning. The pattern was there. The debriefing officers at U-boat headquarters had documented 17 separate incidents by early May. 17 experienced commanders reporting the same. Impossible thing. German intelligence ran down every lead. Radio intercepts showed nothing unusual. Captured equipment from downed British aircraft contained only the familiar 1.5-meter radar systems they'd been dealing with for 2 years. Agents in Britain reported nothing out of the ordinary. The data said nothing had changed. But U-boats were dying. Headquarters faced an impossible choice. Either the METOX receivers were failing in ways that couldn't be detected during testing, or the British had developed a completely new type of radar that German engineers said was physically impossible. The staff chose to believe the equipment was failing. The alternative was too disturbing to consider. It would mean German radar research was years behind. It would mean every tactical assessment, every strategic assumption, every operational plan was built on a foundation that had quietly collapsed. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that on March 17, 1943, A British Wellington bomber had taken off with something revolutionary installed in its belly. The ASV Mark III, a radar system operating on 10-centimeter wavelength. It could spot a surfaced U-boat at 10 miles. It could detect a periscope at 5. And every METOX receiver in the German submarine fleet was completely blind to it. But the technology behind it was almost absurdly simple. A copper cylinder, 8 centimeters wide, 6 centimeters tall, 400 grams. Inside were 8 resonant cavities arranged around a central cathode. When powered up, electrons spiraled through a magnetic field, stimulating microwave oscillations that synchronized into coherent output at 3000 MHz. It was called a cavity magnetron. 2. British engineers John Randall and Harry Boot had invented it in February 1940 at the University of Birmingham. Before the magnetron, vacuum tubes couldn't generate enough power at wavelengths shorter than 50 centimeters. The physics just didn't work. The magnetron solved problems engineers had been struggling with for a decade. The first prototype generated 400 watts at 10 centimeters. That was 50 times more powerful than anything that had come before. By June 1940, they had production models generating 10 kilowatts in short pulses, enough to build radar with detection ranges measured in dozens of miles. The complete ASV Mark III system weighed about 200 pounds. It needed constant maintenance. Magnetrons burned out after 40 to 60 hours. The rotating antenna jammed in humidity. Cathode ray tubes failed from vibration. Coastal Command ground crews spent more time fixing ASV Mark III than any other piece of equipment. But when it worked, it changed everything. An aircraft with ASV Mark III could patrol at night or in fog and detect surfaced U-boats at ranges where visual contact was impossible. The submarine got no warning until the aircraft was less than a kilometer away. By then, it was over. A U-boat needed 30 seconds to crash dive to safety. Aircraft could close 1 kilometer in 15 seconds. The technology had originally been developed for H-2S ground mapping radar used by Bomber Command. But in March 1943, Churchill personally ordered it rushed into maritime service. He'd been briefed on the March losses. 82 ships in 1 month. If that continued, Britain would be negotiating surrender by autumn. On March 25th, Churchill summoned Air Chief Marshal Philip Joubert. Bomber Command had been hoarding H-2S production for months. Churchill overruled them on the spot. 20% of all production would be diverted to Coastal Command immediately. Air Marshal Harris protested. Churchill told him the Battle of the Atlantic came first. Without the Atlantic supply lines, there wouldn't be a Britain left to defend. The ASV Mark III entered operational service in March. The first kill came on March 22nd. A Wellington from 172 Squadron detected U-665 in the Bay of Biscay. The submarine's METOX gave absolutely no warning. The aircraft appeared at 300 meters and dropped 6 depth charges before the crew could even react. U-665 survived, but limped back to base so badly damaged, it was out of action for months. Over the next 6 weeks, ASV Mark III-equipped aircraft sank 11 U-boats and crippled 23 more. Almost none detected the radar before the attack. METOX receiver stayed silent. U-boat commanders reported that British aircraft must be using visual detection. There was no other explanation for finding surface submarines at night in the middle of the Atlantic. German intelligence investigated every attack. They questioned survivors. They analyzed patrol logs. They examined recovered equipment. Everything checked out. METOX receivers function normally. British radar should be operating on the frequencies they'd been using for 2 years. Nothing unusual. Nothing to explain what was happening. Then in early May, a rumor started circulating among returning commanders. Captured British aircrews were supposedly telling interrogators that Coastal Command was homing in on radiation emitted by the METOX receivers themselves. The story went that superheterodyne receivers emit weak signals on their intermediate frequency, and British aircraft had developed direction-finding equipment sensitive enough to detect those emissions from 50 miles away. The story sounded plausible. German engineers confirmed that METOX receivers did emit detectable signals at their intermediate frequency of 455 kHz. The emissions could theoretically be picked up at a mile or 2 with specialized equipment, but 50 miles. Engineers ran the calculations. It would require receiver sensitivity 50 decibels better than anything currently possible. It would need directional antennas several meters across. Equipment that heavy and bulky couldn't fit in patrol aircraft. The physics didn't support it. But the alternative was even less believable. If the British weren't detecting METOX emissions, They must have developed completely new radar on frequencies METOX couldn't receive. That would mean wavelengths shorter than 60 centimeters. German research had concluded years ago that centimetric radar was impractical. Power output too low, range too short, components too unreliable. British engineers must have reached the same conclusions. Basic physics didn't change based on which side of the channel you were on. The intelligence staff faced an impossible choice. Accept that the British had achieved a technological breakthrough German science said was impossible, or accept that British aircraft were detecting METOX through methods German engineers said were impractical. Both seemed equally unlikely, but U-boats were dying, and headquarters needed to give commanders some guidance, some explanation, some way to survive. The decision was made to assume the METOX emission story was true. It fit known physics. It could be tested. It could be countered by simply shutting off the receivers. The alternative centimetric radar was too disturbing. If the British really had operational centimetric radar, it meant German radar research was years behind. It meant the technological assessments guiding the entire war effort were fundamentally wrong. That was too large a shift to make based on speculation. On August 3, 1943, Admiral Donitz issued an emergency order to every U-boat at sea. Shut off METOX receivers immediately. Better to operate without radar warning than broadcast your position to every British plane within 100 kilometers. What Donitz didn't know was that the METOX emission story was deliberate disinformation. A captured British pilot had been carefully briefed before every patrol on exactly what to say if interrogated. British intelligence knew aircrew would be questioned about radar systems. They'd prepared a cover story specifically designed to protect the ASV Mark III secret. Something technically plausible. Something German engineers would believe because it fit their understanding of what was possible. The deception worked perfectly. German intelligence verified that METOX emissions were technically detectable. They never suspected the real answer was radar operating on frequencies their receivers couldn't even hear. The cruel irony was that shutting off METOX made submarines more vulnerable. The old 1.5-meter ASV Mark I was still in use on many British aircraft. METOX could detect that system just fine. With receivers shut off, U-boats were blind to both old and new radar. The August order increased losses instead of reducing them. By late May 1943, the pattern was unmistakable to anyone looking at the numbers. Convoy Untouchable 5 had been attacked by over 40 U-boats. 13 merchant ships were sunk, but 6 submarines were destroyed and 7 more damaged, so badly they had to abort. That was 15% of the attacking force. In previous convoy battles, Germans typically lost 1 or 2 boats while sinking 15 to 20 merchants. The ratio had reversed. Convoy HX to 37 in mid-May was worse. 17 U-boats attacked. They sank 0 merchant ships. 5 submarines were destroyed. 4 more were damaged. Perfect defense. Devastating losses. It had never happened before in the entire Battle of the Atlantic. Convoy SC-130 at the end of May was the breaking point. Admiral Donitz's son Peter was serving as watch officer on U-954, part of the Wolfpack assigned to attack. On May 19th, U-954 was detected by a British escort frigate and sunk with depth charges. And no survivors. Peter Donitz was 21 years old. When the news reached Donitz, he ordered an immediate review of all Atlantic operations. The staff presented the statistics. In May alone, 41 U-boats lost. 25% of the operational submarine force. Another 37 boats damaged, some so badly they'd be out of service for months. In exchange, submarines had sunk only 58 Allied merchant ships, 34 of those in the Atlantic. The mathematics were devastating. German shipyards could eventually replace lost submarines, but they couldn't replace experienced crews. Most of the commanders killed in May were combat veterans with multiple successful patrols. Their knowledge, their instincts, their ability to read situations and make split-second decisions, none of that could be taught in training. The U-boat force was losing its institutional memory, its tactical expertise, its ability to fight effectively. On May 24, 1943, Donitz made the hardest decision of his career. He sent a signal to every U-boat in the Atlantic: withdraw from convoy routes immediately. Return to base. Suspend all offensive operations until further notice. The Battle of the Atlantic was over. Germany had last. In his war diary, Donitz wrote, "We are at present facing the greatest crisis in submarine warfare. The enemy has rendered fighting impossible through use of location devices and is causing us heavy losses." He didn't know what those devices were. He didn't know how they worked. He didn't know how to counter them. All he knew was that submarines couldn't operate effectively anymore. Continuing to send them into the Atlantic was throwing away crews and boats for no gain whatsoever. The withdrawal order marked the end of the U-boat offensive that had nearly starved Britain into submission. For 3.5 years, German submarines had terrorized Atlantic convoy routes. They'd sunk 2,300 Allied merchant ships, over 11 million tons. They'd killed 30,000 merchant seamen. They'd come within weeks of cutting Britain's supply lines completely. Churchill himself later admitted the U-boat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war, and it had been stopped by a 10-centimeter radar system the Germans didn't know existed. The truth began emerging slowly. On September 4, 1943, for months after the May withdrawal, Telefunken delivered the first Naxos radar warning receivers to U-boat bases. Naxos could detect centimetric radar. It operated between 2,500 and 3,750 MHz, covering the 10-centimeter band the British were using. Finally, German submarines had a way to detect ASV Mark III before it could guide aircraft to their position, but it was too late. By September, Allied anti-submarine forces had grown so powerful that even with radar warning, U-boats couldn't operate safely. Very long-range B-20 for Liberator bombers had closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers provided continuous air cover over convoys. Hunter-killer groups with the latest sonar and radar actively hunted submarines instead of just defending merchants. Allied shipyards were launching new vessels faster than U-boats could sink them. Naxos revealed what had been killing U-boats for 5 months. Operators reported detecting 10-centimeter radar at ranges up to 5 miles. That was enough warning to dive before aircraft could close to attack range. But Naxos was temperamental. It suffered from false alarms. Its sensitivity made it pick up signals from ships and aircraft too far away to be threats, causing unnecessary dives that wasted precious battery power. Many commanders found it almost as frustrating as having no warning system at all. The Germans tried to adapt. They developed new tactics for operating under constant surveillance. They equipped submarines with more anti-aircraft guns and ordered them to fight on the surface instead of diving when attacked. That led to disasters. British aircraft were heavily armed and could destroy submarine gun positions from outside their effective range. They tried moving operations to different areas. Submarines were sent to the Indian Ocean, South Atlantic, Caribbean, anywhere convoys might be less protected. But the Allies had centimetric radar everywhere. ASV Mark III and American equivalents were standard equipment on maritime patrol aircraft worldwide. By late 1943, there was nowhere left to hide. The fundamental problem was that submarines had lost their primary advantage. For 3 years, U-boats had operated on the surface at night, invisible to Allied radar, faster than escort ships, able to position themselves for attacks. That advantage was gone. Centimetric radar could detect surface submarines at night as easily as in daylight. U-boats were forced to operate submerged for most of their patrol, which cut speed from 17 knots to 7, reduced operational range by half, and made it nearly impossible to intercept fast convoys. Battery endurance became the critical limitation. A Type 7C submarine carried 2 banks of 60-cell batteries. At maximum submerged speed of 7.6 knots, batteries exhausted in 90 minutes. At economical speed of 4 knots, endurance extended to 80 hours. But 80 hours submerged meant 80 hours of limited mobility, no ventilation, no battery charging, no opportunity to attack. When batteries exhausted, submarines had to surface and run diesel engines to recharge, taking 4 to 6 hours. During that time, they were vulnerable to radar detection. The cycle became self-reinforcing. Submarines stayed submerged to avoid radar. Staying submerged exhausted batteries. Surfacing to recharge exposed them to radar. Diving to evade aircraft used more battery power. Running submerged to operational areas consumed battery power that could have been saved for the return voyage. Boats were spending more time hiding and less time hunting. Patrol effectiveness dropped by more than half. By the end of 1943, U-boat operations had become suicide missions. New submarines were sent into the Atlantic with inexperienced crews who had no idea how to fight Allied technological superiority. Loss rates climbed above 50%. Some boats were sunk on their first patrol before even reaching operational areas. The average lifespan of a U-boat in the Atlantic had dropped to less than 3 months. For comparison, the average lifespan in 1942 had been over a year. Training couldn't compensate. The U-boat school at Gotenhafen turned out new crews every month, but they received only 12 weeks of training before assignment. 12 weeks to learn navigation, torpedo tactics, damage control, diesel maintenance, radio procedure, and 100 other skills experienced crews had refined over years. New crews were technically proficient, but they had no combat instincts. They didn't know how to read tactical situations. They didn't know when to attack and when to evade. They didn't know how to survive. Werner Henke survived until April 9, 1944, when U-515 was sunk by American destroyers and aircraft from USS Guadalcanal. 16 crew members were killed. 44 survived, including Henke. He was taken prisoner on June 15th, while being held at an interrogation center at Fort Hunt, Virginia. He attempted to escape and was shot and killed. The ASV Mark III remained classified until after the war. German intelligence never fully understood what happened during Black May. They knew the British had developed some form of new radar. They knew it operated on centimetric wavelengths, but they never realized how early it had been deployed or how completely it had changed the tactical situation. German records from May 1943 are filled with references to unknown Allied detection methods and mysterious location equipment. British Coastal Command eventually published statistics on ASV Mark III effectiveness. From March through July 1943, aircraft equipped with the new radar sank 37 U-boats and seriously damaged 49 others. That represented over half of all U-boat losses during that period. Most attacks came without warning. Crews who survived reported that radar detectors gave no indication of approaching aircraft until it was too late to dive. The Germans eventually developed their own centimetric radar. The Berlin series, based on a captured British magnetron recovered from a downed bomber in February 1943, entered service on U-boats in late 1944. But by then, the Battle of the Atlantic was long over. The submarines it was installed on were mostly used for weather reporting and transportation missions, not convoy attacks. The technology came too late to change anything. Admiral Donitz remained convinced throughout the war that a combination of factors defeated his U-boats in May 1943. Better Allied training, improved tactics, more escort ships and aircraft, closing of the mid-Atlantic air gap, better sonar and depth charges. He knew centimetric radar was part of the answer, but he never fully grasped how decisive it had been. He thought it was one element among many. He didn't realize it was the primary factor that rendered his entire tactical doctrine obsolete overnight. The final statistics tell the story. In March 1943, U-boats sank 82 Allied merchant ships in the Atlantic. They lost 12 submarines, a ratio of almost 7 to 1 in Germany's favor. In April, they sank 39 ships and lost 15 boats. The ratio dropped to about 2.5 to 1. In May, they sank 34 ships and lost 41 submarines. The ratio had reversed. For every merchant sunk, Germany lost more than one submarine. After May, the ratio never again favored the U-boats. By the end of 1943, it took more than 3 submarine patrols to sink a single merchant ship. By 1944, it was closer to 5. The U-boat force kept fighting until the end of the war, but it never again threatened the light convoy routes. The offensive capability that had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic had been broken in a single month by a radar system operating on a wavelength German receivers couldn't detect. That's how was I won. Not through massive battles or brilliant strategies, but through small technological advantages that one side doesn't know the other possesses. ASV Mark III wasn't a wonder weapon. It was a modest improvement over existing radar technology made possible by a new type of vacuum tube that could generate shorter wavelengths, but deployed at the right moment against an enemy who didn't know it existed. That modest improvement changed the course of the war. A copper cylinder, 8 centimeters wide, 400 grams. It saved Britain, and the Germans never saw it coming.